to my subject. I'll be here again tomorrow to say some more about intonation. You've learned quite a lot about the component parts of English intonation over the last few days. But what we're interested in, of course, is whole tunes, whole combinations of these parts applied to a sentence, to an utterance, so that it means something, people can understand what you want to say. You also want to be able to listen to whole tunes and interpret them. We have to think about planning tunes, making up your own tunes. We have to think about performing tunes. It's one thing to plan it, but having planned it, can you then actually perform it the way you planned? And a third thing is listening to a tune, analyzing it, and figuring out what intonation components have been used to make that tune. The tune which is applied to an utterance is independent, really, of the words. I know that intonation is bound up with meaning, but when we have longer to train people in intonation, when I have people for a whole year to teach them intonation, I like them to be able to apply any intonation to any set of words, regardless of the meaning. In fact, I deliberately encourage people to apply silly intonation patterns just as an exercise. Because if you're partly relying on the meaning, then you're not really working the intonation system as a formal system. Of course, mainly you want to mean something, and so it's right that the intonation should fit in with the meaning. But for real technical mastery of intonation, you have to be able to do anything. And the words don't really matter. Some people find it relatively easy to replace the words with meaningless syllables like la, 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 and produce intonation pattern. Other people find this very difficult. I don't know why. But I can take a sentence, which I have in front of me here, transcribed with its intonation. I won't use the actual English syllables, and I can turn it into la, 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 la. And you can imagine that if those syllables were replaced with the appropriate ones, it would be some English intonation pattern, and you would recognize it. Or la 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 la. La 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 la. Yes, that's a rising head and a high fall. So we should be able to do it just like that. At any rate, we do need a systematic approach to intonation. We need to be able to analyze patterns, understand what makes them work the way they are. And when we're listening to something, we need to be able to decompose it into its parts and say, oh yes, that's such and such a nucleus, there's an accent there, that's that kind of head, and so on. Again, with practice, it is possible to do this, as we would say, in real time. So my colleagues and I, if we like, we stop listening to what people are saying, and in comes speech, and I'm saying low pre-head, falling head, fall. It's just, you can do it as it streams past. And I often find myself listening to the radio or the TV like that, not actually taking in anything of what is being said, but sort of mapping the intonation pattern. Now, you've learnt a particular way of dealing with intonation patterns, the O'Connor and Arnold system. There are many other ways of analyzing English intonation, and they all have merits. I don't want to say that any of them is wrong or any of them is right. This is a system which uses tonetic marks, which were invented 50 or 60 years ago by Roger Kingdon, and then developed by O'Connor and Arnold. And in practice, it seems to be a very good way of doing it. People can learn them and can make use of them. The book by O'Connor and Arnold, The Intonation of Colloquial English, divides whole tunes into 10 basic tunes that put together into 10 common combinations. Of course, they didn't mean that only those 10 are ever heard. They meant that those 10 are extremely useful and will enable you to say just about anything you want to say. And we can group the 10 into a number of basic types, which are set out on your handout, there's a group of tunes which are essentially falling, a group which are essentially rising, or not low at the end, and there are two falling rising tunes. Let's just have a look at them. In the falling group, we have the combination high head and high fall. An example, if I read it, will be, she's the very person I was thinking about. She's the very person I was thinking about. That is a high head beginning with the first syllable of very, and a high fall on the first syllable of thinking. A very similar pattern is obtained by using a low fall instead of a high fall. She's the very person I was thinking about. She's the very person I was thinking about. The head and the tail are the same, just the fall starts at a lower pitch. If you like messing about with recordings of speech, either on tape or on computers, you'll find you can take those patterns, cut them up and splice them together again, and it will all fit. All you've done is switch a low nucleus in place of a high one, and the rest sounds correct. It's a nice demonstration that it's actually made up of these independent bits that will stick together, rather like a toy construction kit for making intonation patterns. So rise fall comes next. It's reckoned to be a fall because it has the same kind of meanings and uses, and it ends up low. The example is, she's the very person I was thinking about. You hardly ever need to use that. I would say don't bother with making it. You don't need to bother with making it. You may need to recognize it sometimes, but you don't need to use it. And then there is a pattern which, again, has a high fall, but a different kind of head. She's the very person I was thinking about. She's the very person I was... This time the head, which runs from very to was, is rising. Very person I was. Pop, 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 like that. Previously I had a high head. Very person I was. Falling nuclei are by far the commonest type of nucleus in every kind of situation. And you should not be afraid of using falls. When people first learn about variety of intonation, I think they sometimes feel, oh, I mustn't use a boring old fall again. I better put in a rise fall or something to liven it up. Don't do that. There is nothing wrong with falls. You can use fall after fall after fall, and nobody minds. If you insert too many different kinds of nuclear tone for variety, then you get a rather strange effect, too much going on. Then there are the rises. These have in common that at the end of the pattern the pitch is going up, and if there's a tail, the pitch will continue to go up. So we have high head and low rise. The very person I was thinking about. The nucleus is on the first syllable of thinking, and after that the pitch is rising, thinking about. You can probably hear that the pitch rises a lot more right at the end, actually, on about, thinking about, goes thinking about, and there's a kind of swoop up in pitch on about. This sometimes misleads people. They think that about, in this example, would be the nucleus. And of course, about does have the biggest rise, but tracing the rise back to its start, you get thinking. The level tone, giving the tune called terrace, is also put in the rising group because it has the same kind of functions. The example here is, she's the very person I was thinking about. She's the very person I was thinking about. This level tone can be used in very many of the places where the low rise can also be used. One application, for example, is in listing things. When we're listing things, often we use rise, 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 and then fall at the end of the list. So we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's rise, 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 fall. But you can do the first elements with a level, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's just as good. In fact, a student of mine a few years ago collected some data which involved English speakers, reading lists, and she found that commonly the earlier items in a list were said with level tones and not with the rises that she had expected to find. Then we have the high rise, high head and high rise. She's the very person I was thinking about. The high-rise pattern is often used to ask questions. Obviously, this isn't a question. When it's not being used to ask a question, it may have pretty much the same function as a low-rise. And then another use for the low-rise with a different kind of head, a low head and a low rise. In the last example of rises, we get, she's the very person I was thinking about. She's the very person I was thinking about. The low head is at approximately the same pitch where the rise takes on. And lastly, we come to these two tunes which fall and rise. They're actually two, though often difficult to tell apart. One is a simple tune using a fall-rise nucleus. The first example there is, she's the very person I was thinking about. The nucleus is on the first syllable of thinking, and from there to the end, the pattern falls and then rises, thinking about. The tonetic mark, meaning fall rise, that little V placed in front of think, is sometimes the source of confusion to people. They think that the fall rise has to happen all on the syllable marked, or they maybe do the fall and then forget to rise at the end. So what it means is fall here and save up a rise for later, thinking about. You have to be rising at the end. And then there's another kind of tune which both falls and rises, and we say that it's compound. It's made up of two nuclear tones. First a high fall, and then later on a low rise. So we get, in the example shown, she's the very person I was thinking about. She's the very person I was thinking about. That is not equivalent, by the way, to the first example of the simple fall rise. The nucleus is in a different place in the two examples. In the simple case, the first one given, the nucleus was on the first syllable of thinking. In this particular compound example you're looking at now, the nucleus is on the first syllable of very. And here's another example. She's the very person I was thinking might come. Now the nucleus is on the first syllable of thinking, but more material is required in order to justify the use of the compound pattern with its additional rise. So come has been added in that example, so the come will fit in. For many practical purposes, you don't have to bother about the distinction between fall rise and fall plus rise. So there is a very real difference, in my opinion. Now, these patterns seem quite complicated. It's all very well for me to read out the examples, but how are you going to be able to do this? When you see an example with tone marks supplied, there is a little skill or technique involved in getting it right and reading it out correctly. And I've given some hints at the top of the second page of the handout. When you're making whole tunes, when reading from phonetic stress marks, it's advisable to start by practicing the nuclear tone first and the tail if there is one. And once you've got that right, you can begin to add the rest. So you fit in the rest of the pattern bit by bit. This is very different from merely starting at the beginning and trying to read straight through. Until you have developed the skill, if you start at the beginning and just try to go straight on through, you'll probably go adrift, you'll end up at a pitch you didn't want to be at, you lose control of the whole thing. So better to look at the whole pattern, preview what you're going to do, sort of visualize what you're going to do, and start by practicing the nucleus. Let me give an example. There are some sentences there for practice. Number one has these words, but couldn't we leave it till Friday? Now, the thing to do is look first for the nucleus. You can recognize the nucleus because of its special phonetic stress mark. You see that the word Friday carries the nucleus. Now, doing Friday with a high fall, we'll get Friday, Friday, or Friday. You know there are two ways of pronouncing the names of the days of the week. I don't mind whether you say Friday or Friday. Friday is the traditional way, Friday is the new way, surprisingly. Shall I say, do you normally say Friday? You prefer, I'll go along with you, we'll say Friday then. Friday, Friday. Now, say it several times over, get it fixed in your mind, and then you know you're going to end up with Friday, Friday, Friday. Now, is there a tail? There is a tail. It's the second syllable of Friday, and that is on a low pitch. Syllables after a falling nucleus are always on a low pitch. Friday. Is there a head? If there's a head, there must be one accented syllable before the nucleus, at least. And indeed there is. You see there is a mark in front of the first syllable of couldn't, which tells us that a high head is to begin there. First syllable of couldn't is to have an accent. What kind of a head is shown? Well, it's a high level head. That tells us that on the first syllable of couldn't, we are to start a high pitch and continue that high pitch through the head. So it would be couldn't we leave it, couldn't we leave it till? Yes, couldn't we? It's actually harder than you might think to stay on about the same pitch. Because again and again I'll find people will say, couldn't we leave it till you're going up and down, and that's not what the marks are showing us. It's to start there and stay there, more or less. It doesn't have to be absolutely level. You don't have to draw it on a ruler or something. But what we don't want is big ups and downs. Because if you make big ups and downs, you probably make a pattern that the listener thinks is a nucleus, and then you've no longer got the nucleus coming up in the right place on Friday. So where are we? You're going to say Friday, Friday, and then in front of that, couldn't we leave it till Friday? We're almost there, and in front of that, we have to fit the first word, but, which will be, in my pronunciation, a weak form, but it'll be a pre-head. It's not marked with any pitch marks, so it must be a low pre-head, giving, but couldn't we leave it till Friday? But couldn't we leave it till Friday? Yeah. Now, this is where I want you to do some practice. You need to introduce yourself to the person sitting next to you if you don't already know her or him. And I would like you to listen to each other as you try to apply the technique I've suggested. You have further examples, 2, 3, 4, 5, plenty of material to work through. See if you can apply the same technique. Start with the nucleus, get the nucleus fixed, add on the tail if there is one, add on the head bit by bit, and then the pre-head. And as you add more and more, don't let the nucleus go wrong. Always end up with the same nucleus you had to start. Now, let's spend a few minutes practicing that. I will come around and eavesdrop. I shall listen, and you can ask me any questions you may have as you try.
Highly
Please
honored.
try. This is the difficult bit. Re-establishing my presence when you're talking to each other. Right, okay. At the risk of repeating myself, I'm going to give you the same advice, because as I come around I find that people are so keen to read the whole pattern They're forgetting. You are forgetting the basic advice, which is to get the nucleus right first and add the rest on. Look at number 2, which you must have tried by now. You've all tried number 2 at least once. If I apply my technique to this, I look through the tonetic marks until I find the nuclear tone. It's that little mark, V mark, in front of the F in interfering. Remember, the nuclear tones are marked with particular marks. You can always tell which is the nucleus because it's using one of those 7 marks. I know there is a very nice looking mark, a big arrow, in front of the word hope, but that isn't a nuclear tone. That indicates the beginning of a head. So the thing we have to start practicing is the pronunciation of interfering. And indeed, just the fearing bit, I'm going to miss off the inter part to start with, because the nucleus doesn't start until we come to the 3rd syllable of interfering. Hence, you should first be practicing fearing, fearing, fearing. That's it. Now it's lovely. Now, the discipline is fix that in your mind, and then whatever else you do, no matter what happens to the pitch, when you come to the end, you're going to do that beautiful fearing, fearing. If you like, you say fearing 10 times, 20 times, till it's automatic. And then you're going to fill in the rest. Come to the place where the nucleus starts. Forget everything you've done and just do your fearing that you've practiced. And then it will be right. Now, the downwards pointing arrow, the slanting down arrow in front of the word hope, tells us that the kind of head here is a falling head. This means a head which starts on a high pitch and gradually comes down, smoothly comes down the whole time. In many ways, the arrow is misleading, I think, because people look at the arrow, they follow it down, and they think, right, down. So they start down. But really, there should be another arrow pointing up just before it, saying, if you're going to come down, the first thing you have to do is go up. You can't come down unless you've gone up. So it's hard to choose a mark that is adequately powerful to remind you of what to do, but an arrow up and then down. So, and in fact, listening to these patterns, I think that the falling is not really so important. What is important is that it starts at a high pitch. If it starts at a high pitch, you tend to fall off, you droop off in pitch anyway, and it sounds good. Hope you don't think I'm into, hope you don't think I'm into, like that. Doesn't really matter how you fall, you've got to be at a high pitch to start with. So we've got fearing, and then hope you don't think I'm into, fitted in front of it. And that gives us, hope you don't think I'm interfering, hope you don't think I'm interfering. And of course, if you set quickly enough and make the range a bit more realistic, then you've got a very natural English intonation pattern that you hear around you all the time. Hope you don't think I'm interfering. So when you practice the remaining examples, as I hope you will every day now, carry these around with you. Don't say anything to each other, just practice intonation patterns. Use this technique. Start with the nucleus and build it up gradually. The next point I have on the handout is about keeping tunes whole. I think intonation patterns are very important to listeners. When we listen to speech, we have the impression that a speaker is fluent or is not fluent, that the speech is easy to understand or difficult to understand. We remember what is being said or we can't remember what is being said. What is it that makes some speech easier to listen to and other speech difficult to listen to? Well, part of it is to do with the way that intonation patterns are packaged and delivered. Because listeners expect that an intonation pattern will contain one unit of information which they can process and make sense of. If you disrupt the intonation pattern by breaking it up, hesitating in the wrong places, then the listener's task becomes very difficult. They've almost got to say, we forget the intonation and try and extract the meaning from the words. Of course, that certainly isn't what native speakers do. They listen to the whole thing first, and then fill in the words. And if immediately after something you said just which words were used, they would say, I'm not quite sure. I know what it meant, and it seemed very fluent, but did he use that word or that? I'm not sure which words were used. So there's a connection between intonation and the apparent fluency of what people say. If you listen to people who are good speakers in the sense that they can always stand up and talk about something, and they get attention and people listen. For example, politicians. They may be talking rubbish, but they may be talking rubbish, but they tend to do it with great skill. Now, what is the skill? It's the skill of planning intonation units and finishing them. A person who wants to be a politician never stops halfway through saying something. They'll say anything rather than stop. And how do you know when they have stopped? How do you know when it's the end of an intonation pattern? Because as the listener, you're picking up the nuclear tones. The end of the pattern is marked by a nuclear tone. So having started on something, you've got to go on fluently and finish it with a nuclear tone. So the moral here is you can appear to be fluent about just about anything, if only you will plan one intonation group at a time. At the end of the intonation group, you can pause. The listener likes you to pause there because they process the information and file it away. And you use that pause to plan what you're going to say next, to the next nuclear tone at the end of that pattern. You can use this as a way to practice things. Again, working together, even working on your own. You can say, right, I'm going to plan a sentence, I'm going to plan something to say. Never mind if it's banal, never mind if it's obvious. I'm going to plan it so that it has a complete intonation pattern, and when people listen to it, they'll think I'm saying something. I am wearing brown shoes. It's a complete intonation pattern. It sounds as if it means something, but it's just obvious. Today, I don't know what day it is. Oh, today is Wednesday. Anything, but just plan it and finish it. Pauses which come at the ends of intonation tunes are pauses which help. Pauses within intonation tunes are hesitations. If we had to define what a hesitation is, it's a gap within an intonation pattern. And that kind of gap makes people think you are not fluent. So plan a whole tune. And you should ideally have an idea about what nuclear tone you use at the end of your tune. From what I said earlier, my advice, you will not be surprised to hear, is use a fall if you're in any doubt. It's always okay to end with a fall. If you end with a rise, then you are leading the listener to expect you're going to say something else. And if you don't then say something else, it's as bad as hesitating halfway through an intonation group in the first place. Well, we've talked about planning patterns, producing patterns. What about hearing patterns? When you hear an intonation pattern and you want to analyze it, again you have to be systematic and apply the units and the rules that you've been learning about. If I say to you, for example, as an example, whatever made you think of that? Whatever made you think of that? What I want you to be able to do is give me a complete intonation description of it. How many word groups does it contain? Where is the nucleus? What is the nuclear tone? What are the accents? What kind of a head is it? And so on. So what do? First of all, you've got to be sure that you're focusing on one pattern at a time, one intonation group. If it's really two, and you try and describe it as 1, then of course there will be confusion. If you can't describe 2 patterns as having the components only of 1. The first thing to go for, again, is the nucleus. Don't start at the beginning and try and work through. Listen to the whole thing and try and decide where the nucleus is. So, in my example, whatever made you think of that? Can you tell me where the nucleus is? It's that. Yes, how do you know that? How do you know the nucleus is that? Partly you expect it to be at the end. Partly it's because you're detecting the nuclear tone, which is a high 4 on that. Whatever made you think of that? That is being stretched out a bit in time, has a big pitch movement on it. If we took it out of context and just pronounced that syllable, we get that. So it's obviously a high 4 on that. So you locate the nucleus, you listen to the shape of the tune. Now this is where these groups on the first page come in. Because when we identify what is the nuclear tone, the end of the nuclear tone and the pitch of any tail syllables are particularly important. You can tell by the ending of something what it must have been. If you've ended up at a low pitch, it's got to be one of the falling group. If you've ended up at a pitch which is middle or rising, it's got to be one of the rising group. And the third group, well, you won't miss that because you'll end up at a high pitch and preceding that there's been a high falling group. So you've got both things going. The reason why I say it's important to listen to the end is that if you fix your attention on some other part of the pattern, you will commonly make a mistake about what the nuclear tone is. So for instance, I know if I had 20 people in a room, and I said, what is the pitch doing when I say that? Some of them would say it's rising. They'd say it's rising, or it's on a high pitch. And of course it is on a high pitch at the beginning, and it is rising a bit at the beginning. I'm going, that. But how is it ending? It's ending on a low pitch. That. At the end. So that's why focusing on the end helps you figure out what the nuclear tone really is. Often when people make mistakes about pitch, it's because they're hearing too much, not too little. They're not approaching it in a systematic way. They're saying, oh, I can hear a rise, that must be a rise. It's going up and down, must be a rise fall. But no, it's none of those things. We've only got 7 to choose from, so we apply these gross criteria. Does it end up low? Was it high near the beginning? Yes, therefore it's a high fall. Once you've identified the nuclear tone, you can try and decide whether there is a head. Now, there'll be a head if there's at least one very noticeable syllable before the nucleus. In my example, we had whatever made you, whatever, obviously, the second syllable of whatever is very noticeable. Whatever made you think of that. So there must be a head, in this case, it begins on the second syllable of whatever. A common problem for those learning the system is to mix up the start of the head with the nucleus. Because people will get the idea, the entirely wrong idea, that the nucleus is somehow the most noticeable syllable. That is not the case. You have to find the nucleus by listening not only to its accent, but also to its pitch. If you just pick out the most accented syllable, you'll often go for the beginning of the head. Whatever made you think of that? Which of those two is more accented? I don't know. I think probably whatever. The one in whatever is the biggest accent, but actually it's not the nucleus. Why isn't it the nucleus? Well, because there is no nuclear tone that goes high, stays level for a bit, and then comes down. There isn't a nuclear tone that has that shape. So by applying an analysis based on the pitch, we can figure out which of them is the nucleus. And lastly, if there's a pre-head, if there's some stuff before the head, you can decide what kind of pre-head. Easy, because there are only 2 to choose from. A low pre-head, which is the usual thing, and a high pre-head, You won't miss those because they're always very squeaky. Whatever. But you can't do that. That would be a high prehead. We're coming towards the end of our time for today. Tomorrow I'm going to, as well as the topic concerned with social interaction, I'll bring some more practice material so that you can go on trying to apply the principles I've mentioned to you this morning. Are there any questions before we finish for today? Okay, thank you very much.